Good morning, everyone. We're here at the at Anesthesiology 2025, the annual meeting of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. This is Mike Grocott for TopMedTalk. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce two guests that we've chatted to before. We had a great conversation last year. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So if we kick off, Sheena, welcome to TopMedTalk.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Sheena Scott. I'm with Scott Healthcare Consulting in Melbourne, Florida, and I work with anesthesiology practices all over the country, helping them with all things anesthesia.
Fantastic. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And Jason.
Yeah, Jason Greenberg, thanks so much for having me, and great to be back again. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at Ventra Health. I also serve as the Chair of the Committee on Practice Management at the ASA.
Perfect. And we're going to have a little chat about governance mistakes.
Yeah.
So where do we want to start with this? What inspired you to bring the topic?
Well, because there are many governance mistakes, and it's something that we see a lot of. And really, I think you kind of have to start with what is the outcome of governance mistakes or having ineffective governance. And really, if you don't have an effective governance structure, many times the group is not able to effectively manage themselves. And so that can lead to all kinds of problems, because if you can't manage bad behavior or you can't manage any of the issues that you have coming up, then you find yourself in a situation where somebody else may want to do that for you, and it's a threat to the group's independence.
For sure. Jason?
Yeah, I'd echo that. It's I think one of the most underappreciated issues that groups face, and it's really one that is a foundation of many of the challenges groups have. We all have experiences, whether in our own groups or in kind of consulting with other groups, where we see this as being kind of the shining issue. Sheena and I spend a lot of time talking about this, thinking through how to manage through some of these issues. So very excited to come here and chat about some of these things today.
So solutions, how do you plan to avoid this? What are the strategies?
Well, I think you have to have a plan to develop an effective governance structure. And, one of the things I always say, one of the biggest mistakes that I see, well, first of all, you start with some smaller groups. And many of them are very democratic. Everybody has to be involved in every decision, which works fine when there's 6 people in the group. And they get up to the very large groups, then they reach a point where they are forced to have some kind of a governance structure. But there's a big range in there between about 8 physicians and 50 physicians, where many of the physicians feel like, I'm an owner, I should have involvement in every decision, and it's just not functional. If you got 35 people trying to make a decision together, it's not functional. So you have to come up with some kind of a structure, and that's something we're going to be here to talk about today. So I don't know if Jason has anything to add to that before we...
Yeah, I think number one, you got to recognize that group governance exists, and that you may have challenges. I think that's the first thing, is just recognizing that many of the dysfunctions that a group might have stem from this issue. If you acknowledge that, the next thing I think you've got to think about, is to Sheena's point, is what you have done in the past may not be what you need to do in the future to manage some of these governance mistakes and governance issues. Most groups are consolidating and growing now. In the past 10 or 20 years ago, they may have been one size. Every 3 to 5 years, they grow, and different sizes of group, different needs of group, the environment out there with payers, hospital systems, it requires you to be nimble and to change your group governance to kind of match the times you're dealing with. And groups often don't do that. They may employ a strategy that existed 20 years ago, and it's just dysfunctional in the system they're operating in today.
And I'm interested how you socialize different models. As you commented, Sheena, on the people expect to have a voice if they've got a stake, but how do you socialize models that are alternative?
So one of the things I like to suggest is that really there's 3 different types of governance in a medical group, the way I think about it. You've got clinical governance, you've got operational governance, and then you've got what I call corporate governance, which is really more like strategic governance. And I think, one of the things you can do is to sort of divide it up, because if you try to lump all that onto one body, it's just too much for one body to be able to handle. And so physicians by nature are going to always go to the clinical, because that's where their comfort zone is first. They're going to take care of all the clinical things first. And then the money is the thing they're next concerned about, right? So they're going to take care of the money things. And now you're 3 hours into the meeting and we have no time to talk about strategy or any of the other things that are important. So I think if you can separate those functions, and then that also has the added benefit of giving everybody who wants a role to play. So that's one of the things I would typically recommend, would be starting with that.
And how do you balance them up?
Balance them up?
Yeah.
Well, your operational governance would be, managing the day-to-day, managing your revenue cycle, managing your contracts. And typically, most groups, I would say, after you get more than about 20 physicians, you probably want a non-physician administrator to help with those things. But then you typically would have a physician lead. That's kind of like the executive branch, if you will. And then I think the clinical governance can often go to your clinical medical directors, have them have some type of a group where they get together. And then your strategic governance really should be with your board. And the board should be freed up to manage the strategic part of it. And many times you see the board kind of stuck in the weeds of the clinical and the operational when they really should be focusing on the strategy.
I would just add, I think that most medical groups would probably have a hard time articulating what Sheena just said. And by that I mean they may not realize that they are often kind of dealing day to day with tactical issues or something related to their current clinical situation. They may not realize necessarily that governance encompasses many different concepts and categories, and they're all incredibly important. So I think to your question, it's important to start out with educating groups about what are the pieces of governance that are important in medical group management. You probably are familiar, if you're speaking to a group, to say, we understand you're probably familiar with kind of tactical day-to-day clinical governance. How do you think about operational governance, and how do you think about strategic governance, and how would you framework the importance of those? And I think as consultants, we've got to go in and kind of educate groups on how these play in the different pieces of their day-to-day, how it plays in the long-term goals, and give them a sense of understanding and a roadmap.
So if I reflect that back, it's about giving them a framework, a conceptual framework, balancing tactics and strategy, and not just coming up with their agenda at the beginning of the meeting and working through it.
Right. And that there's a lot of education that goes into that. For example, in addition to this meeting, ASA does another large meeting in January called Advance, which is focused on things about management and governance and operational things. And so, sending your potential leaders, and it's important to have succession planning, right? You catch your up and coming leaders, you get them educated and get them familiar with the concepts before they actually step into the roles. And then, you can get, like Jason said, a consultant or somebody to help you with the framework. Because really, I know one of the things you and I have talked about is that, physicians don't really get that training anywhere else, right? It's not something you learn in medical school, for example.
And I like to use real world examples, right? I think, in educating a group of physicians, it's one thing to come in with a PowerPoint and say, well, here's the different levels of governance, and here's how you think about it. I'd like to go in and say, hey, look, what are the biggest challenges you faced in the last 5 years? And they say, well, we've faced issues with, our hospital contracting. We've faced issues with our payer contracting. We have group members fighting. And we take those examples and say, well, those are all examples of governance challenges. One relates to kind of your strategic direction. How much time have you spent in the last 5 years, working towards that? Well, we haven't done a lot of that. Okay. One relates to, more operational tactical governance. We typically approach a situation like this. Well, have you thought about approaching it this way? So if you bring it back to something real and tangible, it helps, I think, groups understand, we could have probably approached this differently. And then when you educate and framework and say, well, given everything you faced in the last 5 years, if you kind of pivot in this direction, you may be able to more effectively manage the challenges in the next 5 years.
And I think we've talked before about levels of representation. And so what are good and bad levels of representation? How do you get it right?
Well, I think you want to have a structure that's going to bring forth your best leaders. And many groups will sometimes say, okay, we've got got cardiac, we've got pediatric, we've got this, and we want to have a representative from each. We've got different facilities, and it's important to have that constituency representation, but it shouldn't be the basis of how people are chosen. Because, for example, perhaps in Jason's subgroup, whatever we want to call it, or division, maybe he's got 3 people who would make great leaders, and maybe in my division we don't have anybody. And so if we have the structure set up that says we have to have one from Sheena's division, we have to have one from Jason's division, then we're not going to get the best people, right? So if we end up having 2 people from Jason's division, they just need to be sure that they're communicating with my people and understanding our needs. And I don't think you have to be from my division. And I think that's one of the things a lot of times we see it. And really, when people are selected by that constituency type thing, I think they end up feeling siloed because they feel like I have to represent my constituency, and that's not the role of a board. The role of a board is to wear your big picture hat, and
I think importantly, you said great leaders. So Jason, what constitutes a great leader in this context?
I think probably 3 things. Number one, and I would always label this as number one, is a high degree of emotional intelligence. I think having emotional intelligence is the foundation for any great leader. Unfortunately, I don't think emotional intelligence is learned incredibly well. I think, there are people who can hone their emotional intelligence skills, but I think at the end of the day, much of emotional intelligence is innate. So picking somebody that has that level of understanding and collaboration and consensus building, and isn't kind of a black and white thinker. Secondly, I think it's got to be somebody who has some level of experience. And when you are succession planning within your group and ensuring that you've got a long-term strategy, it's important to be able to kind of train people up and ensure that they've got a strong level of understanding to be able to kind of manage through the situation. Yeah.
And I would add integrity to that, because I think
that's the third.
Yeah.
Well, you're told in exams, never start with a number in a
Yeah, exactly.
Because you're going to forget the third one.
Exactly.
That's why we're here to help.
That's why we're here. We're like, it's yin and yang.
Great team.
Yes, but I do think integrity is really important, because it's very important that everybody respects that person, and they have to almost be above the law, leading by example. And, they can, if they're not doing that, then people are going to distrust the leaders. And so it's really important that they're always thinking in terms of, really having good empathy for understanding another person's situation. A physician that I worked with for a long time, who I thought was a great leader, would always say, this is a small issue for the group, but it's a huge issue to this person. So how can we find a solution that's going to be really helpful for this person that's not going to be detracting from the group? And, I think it's just that having that ability, that humility and that integrity, and really looking for good solutions.
And I'm interested, I think I heard you say, Jason, that you can't teach emotional intelligence, or it's very hard to teach it. So is the assumption that there's a number of people in any particular group who are just not going to be the leaders naturally, or do you think can you train them?
I think that there are certain people that are just meant for leadership, and there are certainly some people that are just not necessarily going to be easy to train as leaders. I think ultimately everybody can be leaders, but there are some that will have an easier path than others. And you can certainly do courses and try to train in emotional intelligence to understand these things. That definitely is the case. But that being said, there are some people in the group, we often refer to them as soldiers, that are there they really get their kind of energy out of kind of the day-to-day tasks, and they are not necessarily folks that are interested in stepping into leadership. So I think you've got to identify that cohort of people that you think have leadership potential, and then take them and enhance them so that they're the greatest leaders possible. I mean, good people have good kind of starting potential won't necessarily be great leaders unless they are harnessed. People with very little potential, it's going to be difficult, even with a huge amount of training, to get them to be the best leaders in the group. You just kind of have to acknowledge who those people are. So
I get this. So we've got leadership and followership.
Yes.
And some people are happy followers. I mean, if I think of my own personal experience, what do you do? What's your advice for the people who believe they're leaders who don't have the characteristics of the good leader?
So it's funny you say that, because I was just going to sort of tag that onto what Jason just said. I think you can find a role for those people. I think they may not have the social skills or emotional intelligence, whatever we want to call it, you might not necessarily want them to be the person that's communicating with the hospital on your behalf, but they might be a very good person to do peer review. For example, they could have a strong role in peer review when they're looking at records, and and they just have to make a short presentation. So I think you can find a role for people that have a lot of enthusiasm but maybe don't have the right skill set. Because I agree with Jason, it's hard to teach some of the skill sets.
And you know what? There are a lot of things to do in a medical group.
Yeah.
The problem you usually have are there's just not enough people to give their time. I mean, you often have 5% of the group doing 95% of the work. So there's never a problem if somebody's interested finding a role for them.
And I think we've also touched on before the management of the mischievous and the malign, the detractors.
Yeah.
And what's your advice with that, Jason?
Yeah. I think you have to start out by defining detractor. I think there's healthy detractors and there are unhealthy detractors. And so it's incredibly important to understand the difference, because I think some people think, well, detractors are a bad thing all the way around. They're not. I think they're really healthy to an organization. So a healthy detractor is somebody who brings up, an alternative approach, considers issues that the group think might not consider. But what's important about the healthy detractor versus the unhealthy detractors, the healthy detractor then constructively comes up with a solution regarding that issue. So if the group comes together and the unhealthy detractor says, hey, think about A, B, and C, and the group decides, well, that's a great point, we'll go with it or we won't go with it, the healthy detractor then decides, you know what, how can I help you then get to kind of where our group consensus is? I think the unhealthy detractor may have a starting point where they decide they want to bring up an alternative opinion, which is great, but perhaps they don't get on board, or they have personal reasons for not getting on board. And even if they truly believe deep down it's the right decision, they continue to follow an approach where they are unconstructive, and that unconstructive pathway can lead to significant issues within a group. So I think you got to identify, is this healthy discourse or unhealthy discourse, and a conclusion from that.
And then you have to manage it. I have one of my favorite governance consultants, who's now retired, Will Latham, used to say, if a decision's made and you don't like it, you have three choices. You can live with it. You can try to get more information and bring the decision back for review, or you can self-select out of the group. But there isn't a fourth choice that says, I didn't vote for this and therefore it doesn't apply to me, and I can go around and be destructive about it. Because once that you allow that kind of behavior, it's really destructive to the group.
And I guess that, Sheena, that brings us naturally to what's the framework, what's your advice for dealing with dissent or even open conflict?
Well, I think you have to have a framework, and that's where you have to have a really strong governance, and they have to be empowered, right? Because one of the things they have to do is sometimes deal with people who are being disruptive, and so they have to know that they have the ability to do that. One of the things I hear most often, sometimes from physician leaders, is that their biggest challenge is dealing with their partners, because sometimes if they're not properly empowered, then they can't deal with those dissenters, and that can put the group at risk. Really the group is as strong as its weakest link. And so I think that has to be an important part of governance, that the leaders are empowered to deal with people who are just being unwilling to get along.
Very, very politely put.
And I would add a couple important points here. Strong bylaws that that the group gets behind and that are vetted are incredibly important. If you don't have the framework in terms of the bylaws of the group, you can't expect that you've got a pathway for dealing with this. The other thing I would say are physicians are classically conflict avoidant. We're not necessarily trained to engage in conflict. That being said, the groups that don't hit up head on when we've got unhealthy detractors will see a significantly more downside in the end if they don't actually take advantage of their bylaws and the pathways they have to deal with it. The last thing I would say is have a great labor attorney, on speed dial at any point. It's important. It's important to do the right thing, to take the health of the group as number one over any individual need. At the end of the day, avoiding conflict, not following your bylaws, not taking care of issues that are out there will lead to group demise.
It's a really clear constitutional framework, and then a good policeman. At the end of it.
Right. Because if you don't, one of the things, and we see this now because we have the workforce shortages, and so people are tending to be more lenient because they don't want to get rid of somebody. But what happens is if you allow an unhealthy detractor to stay there, it's like a cancer. And so you may be stuck with that person, and you may have 5 of your best people leave because they don't like the culture that's been created by this person. So even in these times, which are difficult, you have to be willing to take it on, I think.
And you do a lot of leaders you hear say, people, best part of the job, worst part of the job.
Right.
Yeah, and every group has it, right? It's natural. I don't care, medical group, whatever group you're talking about, it's humanity to have, all ranges of opinion on there. There are always people in every group, whether you're in junior high or whether you're in a complex medical group that you get along with and you don't get along with. It's all about how you manage them that matters.
Which brings us back to the emotional intelligence piece that you raised before.
Absolutely.
So I think we're starting to run out of time. It's been a great conversation. Any kind of last-minute take-homes that you'd like to share before we close?
I would like to put a plug in for two things. Number one, for groups that are struggling with group governance issues, it is incredibly important to consider outside help. You cannot manage these issues alone necessarily, and so I would put a plug to make sure that you have a level of humility to understand when you are beyond your depth of knowledge to be able to manage an issue. I've seen the most successful groups manage these issues by acquiring third-party help on those issues. The second thing I would say is there are great resources out there for groups. One of them is the ASA Advance, as Sheena Scott mentioned. This is I really think it is one of the absolute best resources for groups to talk about practice, operational issues, economics, professional development, etc. This meeting is at the end of January, and encourage everyone to attend because I think it's a great platform to explore more of these issues.
Right. Sheena, take-homes?
Just, I think it's just really important and it's hard to, everybody's so busy and everybody's stretched and they got so much going on. It's hard to make time for governance, but it's really such a foundation to everything we do that it's important to make the time.
Brilliant. Listen, I really appreciate you spending the time, having the conversation. We appreciate the support of Ventra Health for supporting this podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'd like to thank the ASA, as always, for hosting us here at Anesthesiology, and, of course, our regular sponsors, Becton Dickinson and GE. Thanks very much for listening. Look out for us on socials. Look out for us on YouTube. Like us. Do all those nice things, and we will be back soon. Bye-bye.